Welcome to another journey into the quieter corners of history. Tonight we'll drift back to the United States in the early 1900s, an age of progress, but also of struggle. The streets bustled with horse-drawn wagons and early automobiles. The cities smelled of coal smoke and freshly baked bread, of sewage and perfume, of life pressed together in cramped spaces. Some families lived in glittering mansions lined with velvet curtains, while others slept 10 to a room, sharing a single cracked stove. This was America at the dawn of the 20th century, both brutal and beautiful, both hopeful and harsh. As you listen, allow the rhythm of these stories to ease you toward rest. The pace will be gentle, the details soft, and the history boring in the most calming of ways. Subscribe to The Boring Historian for more sleepy history. And let me know in the comments what you'd like to hear next. Now let us begin. The year is 1900. The United States has stepped into a new century, and the world feels restless with possibility. Imagine standing in a crowded city street on a cool spring morning. The cobblestones are slick with dew, and you can hear the distant whistle of a train cutting across the horizon. A milk cart rattles past, the horse snorting, its breath rising like pale smoke in the crisp air. Women in long skirts gather at the market, their baskets filled with turnips, onions, and coarse bread. The smell of coal fires drifts from chimneys, mixing with the salty scent of the docks. The streets are alive with contradictions. A wealthy banker, dressed in a tailored coat and silk hat, steps from a polished carriage, while a ragged newsboy shouts headlines for a penny. At the corner, a factory girl hurries to her shift, her face pale from the long hours of work. The clamor of trolleys mixes with the calls of street vendors. Everything feels both new and impossibly old. For many Americans, life is defined by work. 10 million people labor in factories, their days measured by the turning of great machines. The sound is deafening, the clank of iron presses, the hiss of steam, the roar of looms. Yet others live in rural silence, tending farms that still depend on hand tools and animal strength. A farmer's morning begins with the scrape of a shovel in the dirt, the cry of roosters, and the ache of muscles that never seem to rest. In cities, electricity glows in certain districts, casting yellow halos on the pavement. But just a few streets away, darkness lingers, lit only by gas lamps and candles. Telephones begin to appear in businesses and wealthy homes, their brass receivers polished, their wires running overhead like tangled spiderwebs. Yet most families still write letters by hand, the ink smudging on paper, the words carried slowly by train or by foot. Class divides are everywhere. In New York City, one can walk from a Fifth Avenue mansion with chandeliers that sparkle like stars into a tenement where sewage leaks through the floorboards and children sleep on piles of rags. The contrast is so sharp, it almost feels unreal. The rich dine on roast duck and fine wine, their tables covered with lace cloths and silver forks. The poor boil potatoes in dented pots, sharing broth so thin it seems more water than food. Yet even in hardship, there is a quiet dignity. Families gather around kerosene lamps at night, reading worn Bibles or telling stories. The sound of lullabies carries through open windows, soft voices competing with the noise of passing trains. Children play stickball in the streets, their laughter echoing between brick walls blackened with soot. For them, the century is new, the world still wide open. At the turn of the century, there is excitement about inventions. The Wright brothers are experimenting with flight and Kitty Hawk. Automobiles, noisy and unpredictable, begin to rattle down city streets, startling horses and pedestrians alike. There are whispers of a future where machines might lighten labor, where comfort may reach even the working poor. Yet for now, progress is uneven, and daily life is still dominated by struggle. The early 1900s were also marked by immigration. Ships arrived by the thousands at Ellis Island, carrying weary families from Italy, Ireland, Poland, and beyond. Their eyes, tired from the voyage, widened as they saw the Statue of Liberty rising above the harbor. Some wept with joy, others with fear. Their lives would not be easy, but they carried hope like a flame inside them. The era of America in 1900 is filled with contrasts. The hopeful and the desperate, the rich and the poor, the old and the new. Coal smoke clings to clothing. The clatter of hooves mixes with the chug of engines. In one house, a child drifts to sleep beneath embroidered quilts. In another, a child coughs on a bare mattress, the room damp and cold. What lesson does this opening of this century teach us? That history is rarely one thing. It is not only progress, nor only suffering. It is both. It is the story of wealth that dazzled and poverty that crushed, of comfort that coexisted with pain. At the dawn of the 20th century, Americans endured, some in luxury, others in hardship. And through this mixture of light and shadow, the century prepared to unfold. Imagine yourself stepping into a narrow street on New York's Lower East Side in 1905. The air is thick with the smell of coal smoke, boiled cabbage, and the sour temps of wastewater that seeps into the gutters. Laundry hangs on lines strung between buildings, fluttering like flags in the breeze. The street is noisy. The cries of vendors selling fruit from wooden carts, the chatter of children playing stickball, the creak of wagon wheels carrying barrels of fish, onions, or coal. Now step inside one of the towering brick buildings, the tenements. From the outside, they look solid, even imposing, with their soot-stained walls and rows of narrow windows. But once you climb the steep, splintered staircase, the truth reveals itself. The hallways are dim, the air stale. Gas lamps flicker weakly, and the wooden floorboards creak underfoot. The smell inside is overwhelming: dampness, mildew, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present scent of food cooking in cramped kitchens. Families lived here by the thousands. A single flat, barely 2 rooms, might hold 6, 8, even 10 people. The front room often served as both bedroom and living space. The second as a kitchen, though many lacked proper stoves or plumbing. Water came from shared taps in the hallway. Toilets, when available, were communal and often broken. Rats scurried across the floor at night, and bedbugs clung to the wooden frames where children slept. Life in these rooms was not quiet. Babies cried in the night. Fathers snored after 12-hour shifts at the factory. Mothers coughed as they scrubbed clothes in basins of cold water. Neighbors' voices carried easily through the thin walls, mixing into a constant murmur of sound. Yiddish, Italian, Polish, and dozens of other tongues. For immigrants, the tenements were both shelter and prison, a place of belonging but also of hardship. Yet outside the tenement doors, life was no easier. Streets overflowed with people, carts, and noise. In summer, the heat grew unbearable. Windows were thrown open, but the air was heavy and unmoving. Families dragged their mattresses onto fire escapes, sleeping under the stars to escape the stifling rooms. In winter, frost crept across the inside of windows, and coal smoke filled every lung. Children walked barefoot, their toes blue with cold, while mothers patched clothes until fabric could hold no more stitches. And yet, there was life, even joy, in these crowded streets. Peddlers sang out their prices, voices rising like chants, apples 3 for a penny. Pickles, sour and briny, plucked from barrels. Children played marbles in the dirt. On Sundays, families strolled to nearby churches or synagogues, dressed in their best clothes, though best often meant patched coats and second-hand shoes. A wedding in the neighborhood brought music and dancing, the sounds of fiddles and laughter spilling into the street. Still, the contrast with wealth was stark. Only a few miles uptown, wealthy families lived in spacious brownstones and mansions, their rooms lit with chandeliers, their kitchens stocked with fresh meat, butter, and cream. They had servants to cook and clean, private bathrooms with running hot water, and velvet curtains that kept out the city's noise. In the tenements, families huddled together around small coal stoves, eating soup that was mostly broth, their curtains made from old sheets. For the poor, every penny was stretched, every scrap of food saved. Tenement reformers, like Jacob Riis, tried to show the world what these conditions were truly like. With his camera, he captured haunting images: children sleeping on doorsteps, families squeezed into airless rooms, mothers sewing by the faint glow of a lamp. His book, How the Other Half Lives, revealed to middle and upper-class Americans a side of the city they rarely saw. The photos were grainy, the faces weary, the rooms cluttered and dim. Yet they were real, and they told a truth that many preferred to ignore. Health was always a concern in these cramped spaces. Tuberculosis spread quickly, its cough echoing in the hallways. Cholera, typhoid, and influenza thrived where sanitation was poor. Doctors often avoided the neighborhoods, and hospitals charged fees most families could not afford. Many turned instead to folk remedies, herbal teas, poultices, whispered prayers. Mothers boiled rags for bandages, while fathers hoped a night's rest would heal wounds from the factory. And yet, through all of this, there was resilience. Immigrant families worked hard, saving what little they could. Pennies were tucked away in jars for rent or passage to bring a cousin from the old country. Children attended overcrowded schools, learning English from chalkboards that were cracked and faded. In the evenings, stories were told in the languages of the homeland, while children listened wide-eyed. Straddling two worlds, one left behind, one not yet fully theirs. The lesson of the tenements is a sobering one. Life there was not romantic, not easy, not clean. It was survival, day after day. And yet, within those walls, communities were born, cultures blended, and generations laid their roots. The struggle was immense, but it was also the foundation of what would become modern urban America. In the silence of night, after the streets grew quiet and the gas lamps flickered out, the tenements held the sound of breathing. Hundreds of people resting side by side, in rooms too small, in buildings too full. It was not comfort, but it was life. While families in tenements huddled together in two small rooms, just a few miles away, another America existed. One of opulence, indulgence, and extravagance. The Gilded Age, though fading by the early 1900s, had left behind a class of wealthy elites who lived in mansions that seemed almost like castles perched on the edges of cities or spread across the green hills of the countryside. Imagine stepping into one of these grand homes on a quiet evening in 1905. The front doors are carved from heavy oak, polished until they gleam. Brass knockers catch the glow of gaslights, and when the door opens, a rush of warmth greets you. Inside, the air smells faintly of beeswax polish, tobacco smoke, and the perfume of lilies arranged in crystal vases. The floors are marble, smooth beneath slippered feet, and the staircases rise in sweeping curves, lined with carved banisters and heavy velvet drapes. In the parlor, chandeliers drip with light, their crystals scattering reflections across silk wallpaper. Servants glide silently, carrying trays of silver and glass. On one table rests a silver tea service, steam curling upward from porcelain cups. On another, an untouched plate of petit fours, delicate cakes topped with sugared violets. The furniture is upholstered in brocade, the kind that creaks softly when you sit. And on the mantelpiece stands a gilded clock, its steady ticking filling the silence between conversations. The contrast with the tenements could not be sharper. Here, space is abundant. There are entire rooms for music, for smoking, for libraries filled with leather-bound books whose spines gleam gold in the firelight. There are bedrooms with enormous feather beds dressed in satin covers, curtains heavy enough to shut out the morning sun, and fireplaces lit by servants before the master or mistress stirs. Bathrooms sparkle with porcelain tubs, brass fixtures, and endless hot water. Dinner is a performance. Imagine the long dining table, polished to a mirror shine, stretching beneath a canopy of candles. The smell of roast beef, truffles, oysters, and fine wine fills the air. Servants in stiff uniforms stand at attention, ready to refill glasses at the slightest nod. Men wear tailored black coats, women glitter in gowns stitched with beads and lace, their hair pinned with jeweled combs. Conversation drifts lazily. Business ventures, upcoming trips to Europe, the latest opera performance. Outside, beyond the tall windows, the city waits in darkness. And yet wealth brought not only comfort, but a kind of restlessness. Many of the wealthy felt compelled to display their fortune in the most elaborate ways. Mansions competed with one another for size, for beauty, for extravagance. Some even built homes modeled after European palaces, complete with imported marble, French tapestries, and fountains that bubbled in manicured gardens. Summer cottages, especially those in Newport, Rhode Island, were anything but cottages. They were vast estates by the sea, filled with ballrooms and guest suites. Servants were everywhere in these houses, butler to manage the household, maids to dust and polish, cooks to prepare multi-course meals, grooms to tend to horses, and chauffeurs for the new automobiles. Yet for all the grandeur, the lives of these servants were often invisible, lived in the shadowed quarters below stairs or tucked into attic rooms. They worked long hours to maintain the illusion of effortless comfort. Their presence was constant, yet their voices were seldom heard. Even among the wealthy, there were worries. Behind the silks and jewels, fortunes were sometimes fragile, dependent on the rise and fall of markets, or on industries built on the labor of the poor. Families who lived in grandeur could lose it all in a single financial downturn. The walls of marble could not shield them from scandal, illness, or misfortune. The contrast between these gilded mansions and the crowded tenements is difficult to ignore. One world dined on caviar, while the others shared stale bread. One world rested on feather mattresses, while the other huddled together on bare floors. Yet both worlds existed side by side, often within walking distance of one another. The clatter of factory workers' shoes could be heard only blocks from the quiet drawing rooms of the elite. And there is a strange truth in this division. Luxury did not erase loneliness, nor did extravagance guarantee happiness. Many of those who lived in gilded homes still longed for purpose, or for something beyond the endless cycle of dinner parties and opera boxes. Their children were often raised by nannies rather than parents. Their marriages arranged for wealth rather than love. Behind the glitter, there were silences, just as heavy as those in the crowded tenements. What lesson lies here? That wealth and poverty, though separated by walls of marble or brick, both carried their own burdens. Poverty demanded survival, while wealth demanded display. In one world, the struggle was for food and shelter. In the other, it was for meaning and reputation. Neither life was simple. Neither life was free of hardship. And so, as the 20th century unfolded, America carried within it these two faces, the gleam of excess and the shadow of want. Together, they shaped the rhythm of a nation still searching for balance. If the tenements were the homes of the poor, then the factories were their workplaces. Vast, noisy buildings filled with the sound of industry. Imagine approaching such a factory in 1910. The building looms above the street, its brick walls stained with soot, its tall windows rattling faintly as machines hum within. The air outside is already thick with smoke, and the faint metallic scent of oil and iron clings to your clothing even before you step inside. As the doors open, the noise strikes like a wave. The steady thud of presses, the constant whir of belts, the clanging of hammers on steel. It is not a single sound, but thousands, layered together into a relentless roar. Workers shout to be heard, but their voices vanish into the mechanical chorus. The floor trembles beneath heavy equipment, and the ceiling drips with condensation from steam.
Ow.
Inside, the air is hot and close. In textile mills, the smell of cotton dust fills the lungs, tickling the throat until coughs echo down the aisles. In steelworks, the heat from furnaces burns the skin, sparks flying like tiny stars across the dark. In meatpacking plants, the odor is sharp, metallic, and bloody, mingled with the scent of brine and sawdust. Every industry has its own atmosphere, but each one is overwhelming in its own way. As the workers move in rhythm with the machines. Men bend over anvils, their faces slick with sweat. Women and children crouch at looms, their fingers nimble and quick as they guide threads through endless patterns. The hours are long, 12, sometimes 14 in a single day, and the breaks are brief. A tin lunch pail might hold bread, cheese, or a slice of cold meat. Eaten hurriedly while sitting on a crate before the whistle calls them back, danger is constant. Belts snap without warning, sending shards of metal flying, fingers are caught in gears, ladders slip on greasy floors. A single mistake, one moment of distraction, could mean the loss of a hand, an eye, or even a life. Injuries are so common that some factories keep stretchers at the ready, though medical care is minimal and compensation rare. Many injured workers are simply replaced, their families left to fend for themselves. The contrast with the wealthy is almost painful to consider. While the rich dined under chandeliers, these laborers worked under bare bulbs that flickered and buzzed. While the rich lounged in parlors after dinner, as men and women collapsed into their beds, their muscles sore, their ears still ringing with the roar of machinery. Children of the wealthy learned piano scales in drawing rooms, while the children of the poor learned to operate sewing machines before they were even teenagers. Yet within the factories, there is also a strange sense of community. Workers share glances and stories during their shifts, helping one another when machines jam or supplies run short. In the evenings, they leave together, trudging down the same streets, their boots caked with dust. They know each other's hardships, and they know that survival is often a collective act. Families depend not only on wages, but also on neighbors who will share food when pay is cut or when strikes shut down the mills. And there were strikes, bursts of resistance that punctuated the monotony of labor. Men and women stood outside the factory gates, holding signs, their voices hoarse from shouting, demanding shorter hours, safer conditions, or better pay. Sometimes they won small victories, like a 10-hour day instead of 12. Other times they were beaten back by police or by hired guards, the picket lines scattered by batons and bullets. Still, the struggle continued, because without the factory there was no livelihood. At the turn of the century, the rise of unions gave some hope. Organizations like the American Federation of Labor began to speak for workers, slowly forcing reforms. Laws against child labor were proposed, though they often met resistance from both factory owners and desperate families who relied on every wage earner, no matter how young. Progress was slow, uneven, and often painful. When the whistle blew at the end of the day, the factory doors opened, and the workers spilled back into the streets. Their faces were gray with dust, their clothes stiff with sweat and grease. Yet in their pockets they carried a few coins, enough to buy bread, to pay the landlord to keep the family alive for another week. It was not luxury, but it was survival. The lesson of the factories is one of endurance. Life there was harsh, loud, and unforgiving, yet millions of men, women, and children passed through those doors every day. Their labor built the steel that shaped the cities, the textiles that clothed the nation, the machines that powered the future. Wealth at the top of society was built, brick by brick, on the sweat of those who toiled below. And as the lights of the factories flickered out at night, the buildings stood silent, hulking against the sky, waiting for dawn, when the roar would begin again. If you walked through the crowded neighborhoods of New York, Chicago, or Boston in the early 1900s, you would quickly notice the children. They were everywhere, darting between wagons, shouting on corners, chasing balls down alleyways. Their presence filled the streets with energy, yet behind their laughter was a constant thread of struggle. For many, the street was both a playground and a workplace, both freedom and burden. Picture a boy no older than 10 standing on a street corner with a stack of newspapers under his arm. His cap is pulled low against the morning chill, and his voice is hoarse from calling out headlines. "Extra, extra," he cries, his small hands clutching the ink-stained sheets. Each paper sold earns only a penny or two, but every coin matters. He knows that when the day is done, the money will go to his mother, who must stretch it into food for the family. His shoes are worn thin, the leather cracked, and the pavement bites at his feet with every step. Not far away, a girl bends over a basket of flowers, their scent sweet against the smoke-filled air. She sells them to passers-by, hoping that a businessman might buy a rose for his lapel, or a young woman a bouquet for her parlor table. She smiles brightly, though behind the smile is fatigue. The hours are long, and the weight of the basket digs into her shoulders. She is only 12, yet already she carries herself with the weariness of someone much older. Children in poor families often worked as soon as they were able. Some entered factories, their small hands suited to threading machines or picking debris from coal. Others shined shoes, carried water, or hauled coal. The work was tiring and dangerous, but poverty left little choice. Childhood, in the modern sense of carefree play and schooling, was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. And yet, amid hardship, children still found ways to play. In the narrow alleys between tenements, they played stickball with broom handles and rubber balls, rolled hoops down the street, raced marbles across the dirt, or skipped rope, their chants rising above the clamor of wagons and trolleys. In winter, they built sleds from scraps of wood and soared down icy hills, their laughter echoing through the cold. These moments of joy, fleeting though they were, gave them a sense of freedom. The contrast with wealthy children was striking. The gilded homes uptown, boys played with toy soldiers in nurseries lined with soft carpets. Girls had dolls with porcelain faces, tea sets, and private tutors who taught them French and piano. They wore starched clothes and polished shoes, their days filled with lessons and play under the watchful eyes of governesses. For them, the street was not a place of survival, but a curiosity glimpsed through carriage windows. Yet even in poorer neighborhoods, children shared resilience. They learned to navigate the streets with sharp instincts. When to avoid a policeman, when to run from a drunken passerby, when to seize an opportunity to earn a few extra coins. Their friendships were forged in alleyways and marketplaces, their loyalty tested by hunger and hardship. Many spoke more than one language, carrying the words of their parents' homelands alongside the English they learned in schoolyards. School, when attended, was itself a struggle. Classrooms were crowded, with 50 or more children packed into a single room. Desks were scratched, ink blotters messy, and chalk dust clung to the air. Yet learning to read and write opened doors. A child who could read a sign, fill out a form, or calculate sums had a chance, however slim, of rising beyond the grinding poverty of their parents. Teachers, strict and overworked, often had little patience. Yet for some children, school was a refuge, a brief escape from labor and responsibility. Reformers of the era noticed the plight of these children. Organizations like the Children's Aid Society set up programs to provide food, education, and sometimes relocation to rural homes. Photographers such as Lewis Hine documented the faces of child laborers. Their eyes tired, their bodies small against the massive machines they tended. His images shocked middle-class viewers, forcing them to confront the truth that America's progress was being built on the backs of its youngest workers. Despite reform, change came slowly. Child labor laws were proposed, debated, and resisted by factory owners who relied on cheap labor. Many families themselves opposed restrictions, fearing the loss of wages they desperately needed. It would take decades before childhood, as we think of it today, became something protected by law and valued by society. The lesson of these children is one of endurance. They remind us that childhood is not simply a time of innocence, but also of resilience. In the early 20th century, children carried responsibilities beyond their years, shaping their characters in ways both harsh and profound. Their laughter rang through dirty streets, their games played on borrowed time, but their spirits endured. As night fell, the children of the streets returned to crowded rooms, their small bodies weary, their minds still restless. The glow of gas lamps flickered across their faces as they drifted into dreams. Some dreamed of better days, of shoes without holes, of meals without hunger. Others dreamed simply of play, uninterrupted, unburdened, free. And though the morning would bring work again, for a few hours, they rested. The sun rises slowly over the fields, painting the horizon in shades of pale gold and muted pink.
Ice.
In the early 1900s, more than half of America's population still lived in rural communities. Many of them tied to the land, their survival measured in bushels, harvests, and the unpredictable generosity of the weather. Life on a farm in the early 20th century might sound simple from a distance, but simplicity often meant endless toil, aching muscles, and a constant battle against nature itself. The day began before the sun, often at 4 or 5 in the morning. The air in the farmhouse was still, heavy with the faint smell of wood smoke from the stove and the lingering scent of last night's cornbread. The rooms were cold in winter and stifling in summer. For the farmer's family, there was no such thing as leisure in the morning. Work began immediately. The rooster's crow, the clanging of a tin bucket, the shuffle of boots on wooden floors, these were the alarms of farm life. Men trudged outside to the barns, where the animals awaited. The cows needed milking, a task both tedious and time-sensitive. The sound of streams of milk striking a metal pail filled the quiet dawn, accompanied by the soft, warm smell of hay and livestock. Horses, essential for plowing and hauling, had to be fed and watered. Chickens clucked noisily, impatient for their feed. Even the pigs grunted and pawed at the dirt, demanding attention. Every creature had its place, and each had to be cared for before the farmer even thought about the fields. For women, the morning was equally relentless. They prepared breakfast on heavy cast-iron stoves, balancing kettles of boiling coffee with pans of fried salt pork, biscuits, and sometimes oatmeal. The kitchen filled with the aroma of hot bread and the faint, bitter edge of brewed chicory coffee. But this meal was not leisure, it was fuel, and everyone knew they would soon burn it off in the long day ahead. Children, too, were expected to contribute. Even young boys and girls hauled water from outdoor pumps, carried kindling for the stove, or helped gather eggs. Older children might be assigned to weeding the garden, driving cows to pasture, or walking long miles to school, only to return home to more chores. Childhood in rural America was less about play and more about preparing for adulthood through labor. The farm itself was both a blessing and a burden. Fields stretched across the horizon, but they rarely gave their bounty freely. Crops like corn, wheat, and oats had to be planted, tended, and harvested by hand or with the help of horse-drawn machinery. The work was exhausting. Dust clung to the skin, sweat soaked through shirts, and sunburns peeled across faces and necks. In winter, the challenge is reversed. Snow piled against doors, the water pump froze, and food supplies dwindled to whatever had been canned, salted, or preserved months before. There were moments of beauty, of course, the quiet hum of cicadas in the summer evening, the sight of fields glowing under the harvest moon, or the joy of a well-prepared Sunday supper shared by candlelight. But even these pleasures were tempered by exhaustion. Rest was always fleeting, and tomorrow's work always loomed. The contrast with urban life was striking. City dwellers endured their crowded tenements and harsh factory conditions, but they were not so dependent on the weather for survival. A bad season of rain or drought could spell disaster for farming families. In the early 1900s, crop insurance was limited, and banks were ruthless with debt. One ruined harvest could mean foreclosure, pushing a family off land their grandparents had built with their hands. Meanwhile, the wealthy elite in America dined on imported fruit and sugar, sipping champagne in brightly lit dining rooms, far from the dust and mud of farm fields. Technology was slowly creeping in: mechanical reapers, threshing machines, and later, the first gasoline-powered tractors, but most small farmers could not afford them. They relied on muscle, human and animal. Even when modern equipment was available, it brought debt. And debt was a heavy burden in an economy that could rise or fall with little warning. At the end of a long day, families gathered again around the kitchen table. The lamp's flame flickered, casting soft shadows across worn wooden walls. A pot of beans, a loaf of bread, and maybe a pie if there had been time. This was supper. Conversation was quiet, sometimes solemn. Hands were blistered, backs ached. But there was also a sense of shared endurance. Reflection often came in silence. The farmer might look at his calloused hands and wonder how many more seasons they would endure. The mother might glance at her children, hoping they could one day find easier lives. For some, that meant leaving the farm, chasing opportunity in the city. For others, it meant staying bound by tradition, stubbornness, or simply the lack of choice. The lesson of rural America in the early 20th century was that survival required both resilience and sacrifice. The farm was not simply a home, it was a cycle of labor that bound families together. Sometimes in pride, sometimes in exhaustion, but always in necessity. For many, it was a life lived close to nature, but never comfortably so. And so, as the last embers of the fire died down, and the night insects sang outside the farmhouse windows, another day of simplicity and hardship came to an end. The steady rhythm of steel wheels against iron tracks was, in the early 20th century, the heartbeat of America. The railroad had already transformed the nation in the 19th century, stitching together distant states carrying goods and creating towns where none had stood before. But by 1900, the railroads were no longer a novelty. They were an empire of iron, demanding armies of men to keep them alive. And for those men, life was a mixture of pride, hardship, and danger. Imagine a cold dawn at a small station somewhere in the Midwest. Steam rises from a locomotive, thick and white, carrying with it the acrid smell of coal smoke. The air vibrates with a low hum as the fireman shovels black coal into the furnace. His face smeared with soot, his muscles straining against the endless weight of the shovel. The engineer, perched in the cab, watches the gauges and listens to the hiss of steam, his gloved hand resting on the throttle. These men knew their machines intimately, every groan of the boiler, every click of the wheels. The work was grueling. Engineers and firemen spent long shifts in sweltering heat, their ears ringing from the roar of the engine, their lungs blackened from soot. Rail yard workers labored outside in every season, icy winds in winter, scorching sun in summer. Brakemen ran atop moving trains to set brakes by hand, a task so perilous that many lost fingers, arms, or lives. Conductors bore responsibility for timetables, safety, and passengers. always aware that one mistake could mean disaster, railroad accidents were frequent and deadly. A slip on a wet coupling, a derailment on a sharp curve, or a boiler explosion could kill in an instant. Newspapers often carried grim reports of workers mangled beneath wheels or burned by scalding steam. Yet, for many men, the railroad was still a better option than unemployment. Steady paycheck, no matter how small, could mean survival for a family. Railroad life carried a stark contrast between rich and poor. Wealthy travelers rode in opulent Pullman cars, reclining on velvet seats under crystal lamps, dining on roast beef and fine wine while gazing out of wide windows. Meanwhile, the workers who made those journeys possible sweated in the cabs, froze in the yards, or clung to the sides of boxcars, their wages just enough to keep bread on the table. Immigrants made up much of the railroad workforce. Irish, Italian, Chinese, and Eastern European men bent their backs to lay tracks, hammer spikes, and build bridges. They often lived in rough shantytowns near the lines, their homes nothing more than wooden shacks or tents, their meals little more than bread and beans. Yet, despite the hardships, there was pride in the work. To lay down track was to shape the future, to connect cities, and to be part of something bigger than oneself. The railroad was not only about work, it was also about rhythm. The schedule of the trains dictated life. Small towns set their clocks by the whistle of the locomotive. Families gathered to wave as the train roared past, its plume of smoke drifting across fields and houses. Children marveled at the sight of endless cars rattling by. While merchants relied on the cargo they carried: coal, grain, timber, and manufactured goods. For ordinary Americans, the railroad was both lifeline and spectacle. Yet, behind the romance of the rails was the reality of labor unrest. Railroad workers often organized for better pay, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Strikes erupted, sometimes paralyzing entire regions. The companies, backed by wealthy industrialists, resisted fiercely, hiring strikebreakers or calling in the National Guard. For the men on the ground, standing up for their rights could mean losing their jobs or even their lives. The contrast between the gleaming trains of the wealthy and the struggles of the men who kept them running was stark and unavoidable. At the end of a long shift, a fireman might trudge home with coal dust still clinging to his skin, his clothes reeking of smoke. His hands were blistered, his lungs heavy with soot. His children might greet him at the door of a modest wooden house, built near the tracks, its windows rattling with every passing train. For his family, the railroad was both bread and burden, providing the food they ate, while taking away his health bit by bit. Reflection came quietly, often late at night. Some men looked at the iron giants they served with admiration, as symbols of progress and strength. Others saw them as cruel masters, demanding endless sacrifice without mercy. The lesson of the railroad in early 20th century America was simple but profound. Progress came at a cost, and it was often the working man who paid it. As the whistle blew in the dark, echoing across fields and towns, it was a reminder that America was always in motion. Carried forward by men whose names history would not remember, but whose sweat and labor built the steel veins of a nation. The turn of the 20th century was a time of deep contradictions for women in America. On one hand, many still lived lives that seemed little changed from their mothers and grandmothers, rooted in household labor, childcare, and the quiet rhythm of domestic duties. On the other, new opportunities were beginning to appear: our education, factory work, and even political movements that whispered of change. To be a woman in the early 1900s meant living in two worlds at once, balance between tradition and the beginnings of modern independence. Imagine the life of a farm wife in 1905. Her day began before the sun, with the sharp cry of a baby or the low rumble of cattle outside. The kitchen, with its iron stove and shelves lined with jars of preserves, was her domain. She cooked, washed, churned butter, sewed clothing, and scrubbed floors until her hands were raw. The smell of soap clung to her skin, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily. Yet in her world, these labors were rarely seen as remarkable. They were simply what was expected. In contrast, a wealthy woman in a city townhouse experienced a very different existence. She awoke in a feathered bed, her chambermaid drawing back the curtains to let in the filtered light of morning. Breakfast might be brought on a tray tea toast, perhaps fresh fruit imported from distant lands. Her days were filled with social calls, charity work, or overseeing servants rather than sweating over chores herself. Yet even in wealth, her role was limited. Society expected her to be a symbol of refinement, not an independent actor. For many working-class women, particularly in cities, life was harsher still. Factories and textile mills employed thousands of young women, some scarcely older than children. The air in these spaces was hot and thick with dust, the machines loud and unforgiving. Hours stretched endlessly 10, 12, sometimes 14 per day. Fingers grew numb from repetitive motions, eyes strained in the dim light, and accidents were frequent. Yet wages were meager, often less than half of what men earned for similar work. Women in the garment industry, for example, might earn only a few dollars a week, barely enough to pay rent in a crowded tenement. At night, they walked home through dimly lit streets, their dresses smelling faintly of oil and fabric dust, their bodies aching. The contrast between their lives and the ladies who wore the fine dresses they stitched could not have been more striking. Still, the early 1900s brought signs of change. More women began to attend high school, and some even pursued higher education at newly founded women's colleges. In classrooms lined with wooden desks and chalkboards, young women learned mathematics, literature, and science. They dreamed of careers as teachers, nurses, or writers' roles that were slowly opening, though not without resistance. The air in these institutions was filled with the scent of ink and chalk dust, the sound of pens scratching paper, and the murmur of ambition. The suffrage movement, too, was gaining momentum. Women gathered in meeting halls, their voices calm but determined, demanding the right to vote. Newspapers sometimes ridiculed them, and men often scoffed at the idea of women in politics. Yet the march continued. Banners were stitched by hand, parades filled the streets, and speeches echoed in crowded squares. These women were seen as bold, sometimes improper, but they carried with them the seeds of transformation that would eventually reshape the nation. Race and class further shaped the lives of women. African American women in the South often labored as domestics. Their days spent scrubbing, cooking, and caring for other people's children, while their own families went without them. The pay was pitiful, the respect non-existent. Yet within black communities, women often formed strong networks through churches, schools, and clubs, building resilience and hope in the face of systemic injustice. Immigrant women faced their own struggles. Many arrived from Europe with little more than a trunk of belongings and the memory of a homeland left behind. In crowded tenements, they juggled factory jobs with caring for children, kitchens filled with the mingled scents of old country recipes and the smoke of coal stoves. They lived caught between preserving their traditions and adapting to the demands of American life. Despite all the hardships, moments of beauty and dignity persisted. A young girl might press a flower between the pages of a Bible, dreaming of a different future. A mother might sit by lamplight, sewing clothes late into the night, humming a lullaby as her children slept. A suffragist might write a letter by candlelight, her words carrying conviction across the miles. These small acts, repeated in countless homes, formed the quiet backbone of women's lives in the early 20th century. The reflection here is simple. Women lived lives of endurance and transition. Some remained bound to the old roles of house and hearth, while others dared to step into new spaces, challenging the boundaries set before them. Their struggles were not always recognized, and their labor was often invisible. But it laid the foundation for the freedoms many take for granted today. At the close of the day, a woman might rest her weary body, the sounds of the city or the farm drifting through the window. Perhaps she felt confined, perhaps hopeful, perhaps resigned. Whatever her circumstance, she was part of a vast and quiet story, one of persistence, quiet strength, and the slow march of change. The early 20th century was a time of arrival. Ship after ship crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific, carrying families and individuals who hoped for something better than what they had left behind. Between 1900 and 1914 alone, more than 13 million immigrants entered the United States, their journeys filled with uncertainty, exhaustion, a fragile hope that America might hold opportunities denied to them elsewhere. Picture the crowded decks of a steamship approaching New York Harbor. The salty air is heavy, mixed with coal smoke, and the scent of bodies packed too closely together for too many days. Men clutch their caps nervously. Women cradle infants wrapped in worn shawls, and children peer wide-eyed over the railings. Then, through the mist, the outline of the Statue of Liberty emerges to torch a symbol many had only heard about in stories. For some, the sight brought tears. For others, it was simply the beginning of another struggle. Arrival at Ellis Island or other ports was no guarantee of acceptance. The vast halls echoed with the shuffle of footsteps, the coughs of the weary, and the constant murmur of many languages. Doctors in white coats quickly inspected new arrivals, peering into eyes, checking for signs of disease. Those deemed unhealthy were pulled aside, their futures suddenly uncertain. Families could be separated in an instant, one member allowed to pass, another detained. For the lucky, a stamp of approval meant passage into the great unknown. Life in America was rarely easy. Many immigrants settled in cities where work was plentiful, but conditions harsh. Italian families crowded into narrow apartments in New York's Little Italy, the air thick with the smell of garlic, tomato sauce, and the smoke of coal stoves. Eastern European Jews gathered in the Lower East Side, their tenement hallways filled with the sound of Yiddish voices, sewing machines humming late into the night. Chinese immigrants on the West Coast often found themselves in laundries or small shops, their days long and their treatment often hostile. Wages were low, hours were long, and prejudice was everywhere. Immigrants were often blamed for driving down wages or bringing unfamiliar customs. Signs reading, "No Irish need apply" or "No Italians" appeared in shop windows. Newspapers caricatured immigrants as dirty or untrustworthy. Yet, despite the discrimination, families endured. Clinging to their traditions while learning the rhythms of their new country, the contrast between rich and poor was stark. Wealthy Americans might hire immigrant women as maids or cooks, their labor invisible in the grand houses of the elite. While the dining rooms of the wealthy glowed with chandeliers and polished silverware, the workers who served them returned each night to cramped tenements where several families might share a single room. The aroma of fine roasts and wine faded quickly, replaced by the smell of cabbage soup simmering on a small stove. Still, there were moments of resilience. Festivals brought music and color to immigrant neighborhoods. Street parades filled the air with laughter, the scent of roasted chestnuts, and the clatter of drums. Churches and synagogues provided community, their bells and chants echoing above crowded streets. In these spaces, immigrants found comfort and strength, reminders of the worlds they had left behind. Children often became bridges between old and new. In classrooms filled with the scratch of chalk and the smell of ink, they learned English quickly, sometimes faster than their parents. They played baseball in the streets, their voices a mix of accents and slang. At home, they translated letters, filled out forms, and explained the strange customs of America to mothers and fathers who clung to their own languages. The gap between generations could be wide. But it was also a source of hope these children would belong to the new land in a way their parents never fully could. For many immigrants worked to find their existence. Men labored in steel mills, their bodies drenched in sweat as furnaces roared. Others dug tunnels, paved streets, or hauled loads in warehouses. Women stitched in garment factories, bent over fabric until their backs ached. Every coin earned was precious, and often much of it was sent back across the ocean to support relatives who had not yet made the journey. The lesson of immigrant life was one of endurance and adaptation. America offered opportunities, yes, but it also demanded sacrifice. Traditions were reshaped, languages blended, and families redefined by the constant pressure to survive. The land of opportunity was not generous to all, but it allowed enough hope to keep people striving, believing that the next generation might live with fewer burdens. At night, in a tenement lit by a single flickering lamp, a mother might hum a lullaby from her homeland as her children drifted to sleep. Outside, the city rumbled, streetcars clattering, voices shouting in a dozen languages, the faint whistle of a train in the distance. Inside, there was exhaustion, but also determination. Immigrants in the early 20th century carried with them both hardship and hope. Their lives were filled with struggle, but their presence reshaped America forever, bringing with them new foods, music, faiths, and traditions that would, over time, become part of the nation's fabric. Beneath the polished floors, behind the closed doors, and out of the sight of guests, there existed another world in early 20th century America, quiet. Hidden one, populated by servants. In the grand houses of the wealthy, where chandeliers glittered and dining tables stretched the length of entire rooms, the labor of cooks, maids, butlers, and coachmen kept life running smoothly. Yet their presence was meant to be invisible. Servants were expected to move silently, to blend into the background, and to give their strength, their time, and often their dignity to uphold the comfort of others. Imagine stepping into the basement of a mansion in 1910. The air is damp, heavy with the mingled scents of soap, starch, and coal smoke. Here, the servants' quarters are tucked away. Narrow rooms with iron bedsteads, thin mattresses, and little more than a small trunk for belongings. The walls are bare, the light dim, the atmosphere utilitarian. Above, on the floors where polished shoes clicked across marble, every detail was designed for beauty and show. Below, the world was plain, worn, and endlessly practical. A maid's day began long before the family stirred. At 5 in the morning, she was already awake, striking a match to light the kitchen stove. The fire crackled to life, filling the air with the acrid smell of burning coal. Water was hauled, pots scrubbed, silver polished until it gleamed. Every surface had to shine before the household awoke. By the time breakfast was served upstairs, bacon, toast, and hot coffee, the servants had already put in hours of labor, but there was no recognition. Meals were not shared. Servants ate later in small rooms, often on leftovers. Their food was plain bread, porridge, perhaps a stew if there was time. Conversation was hushed, sometimes weary, as they knew the bell could ring at any moment, summoning them back to duty. The contrast between servant and master was sharp. Upstairs, wealthy families dressed in silks, lace, and tailored suits. Downstairs, uniforms were the rule. Starched aprons, black dresses, polished shoes for the maids, pressed jackets and stiff collars for butlers. These clothes carried no individuality. They were costumes of servitude, designed to erase the person behind the role. Servants worked in near silence. They moved quietly through corridors, delivering trays, drawing baths, setting tables. Their voices were measured, their eyes lowered. To be too visible was a breach of etiquette. The wealthy did not want reminders of the labor that sustained their luxury. And yet, the work was constant. Beds needed changing, rugs beating, windows cleaning, fires tending. Even leisure for the wealthy parties, dinners, dances meant long nights of extra toil for those below stairs. For many servants, the job was one of necessity. Immigrant women often filled these roles, finding few other opportunities open to them. African American women in the South and North alike worked as domestics. Their wages meager, but their options limited. For men, service might mean work as chauffeurs, gardeners, or footmen. The pay was rarely enough to rise out of poverty, but it kept families fed. There was also a quiet humiliation in servitude. To serve meant to know one's place, to step aside when the master passed, to be spoken to as if one were an object rather than a person. Many servants lived with the sting of invisibility, their own desires and ambitions suppressed beneath the demands of the household. Yet for others, service offered a form of stability. Room and board, however modest, was provided, and the structure of the job could offer a sense of predictability in a world often filled with uncertainty. Still, cracks appeared in the silence. Servants shared stories with one another, whispered in kitchens and corridors. They laughed together in fleeting moments, found comfort in friendship, and sometimes even grew fond of the families they served. Bonds formed, though always bounded by class and expectation. The wealthy rarely understood the lives of those who worked for them. They saw only the polished silver, the fresh flowers, the meals served precisely on time. They did not hear the sighs of the maid scrubbing floors late into the night, or the butler's aching feet after hours of standing in stillness. To them, the service was seamless, and that was the point. Reflection reveals the truth. The world of servants was one of quiet endurance. Their lives existed in the shadows of wealth, necessary but unacknowledged. They worked in silence so that others might live in splendor. Their sacrifices were rarely noticed, their humanity often overlooked. Yet without them, the glittering world of the elite could not have existed. At night, when the house finally grew still and the last candle was extinguished, servants retreated to their narrow rooms. Perhaps they wrote letters to family, their hands stiff from the day's labor. Perhaps they simply collapsed into sleep, the muffled sounds of the city above faint in the distance. Tomorrow, it would all begin again, the quiet, invisible rhythm of service. The lesson is gentle but firm. Behind every display of wealth lies unseen labor. The silent world of servants in early 20th century America reminds us that history is not only made by those in bright drawing rooms, also by those who moved quietly in the shadows, sustaining lives they could never share in. At the turn of the 20th century, the world of medicine in America was a place of contradictions. It was a realm where modern science was beginning to make great strides, yet superstition, guesswork, and outright quackery still held sway over the lives of millions. Walking into a doctor's office in the year 1905 could feel like stepping into both the future and the past. The faint odor of carbolic acid, a common disinfectant, hung in the air, mingling with the heavier scent of old wood, stale tobacco smoke, and the faint perfume of tinctures in glass bottles. The tools of the trade lay neatly arranged on a polished tray, shining metal scalpels, saws, and forceps, alongside crude syringes filled with medicines whose efficacy was often questionable. For the poor, however, the idea of visiting a doctor at all was a distant luxury. In cramped tenements, illness was treated at home, often with folk remedies passed down from mothers and grandmothers. Coughs might be soothed with a spoonful of molasses and vinegar. A fever could be sweated out by wrapping the patient in heavy quilts. Babies suffering from colic might be given soothing syrups, bottled concoctions laced with alcohol, morphine, or even chloroform. These patent medicines were aggressively advertised in newspapers and painted in bold lettering on city walls. Names like Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound or Dr. Kilmer's swamp root promised miraculous cures for every ailment, from headaches to tuberculosis. In truth, they often provided only temporary relief for worse, left users addicted to the very substances that dulled their pain. The wealthy experienced an entirely different kind of care. In their well-appointed homes, private physicians made house calls, arriving in polished carriages or early motor cars. They carried black leather bags filled with powders, tonics, and early vaccines. Their patients reclined in soft beds, surrounded by clean linens and fresh air from open windows. Even so, medical knowledge remained limited. Germ theory was gaining acceptance thanks to the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, but antibiotics were decades away. A simple infection could still turn fatal. Surgery was performed without the benefit of blood transfusions or proper anesthesia, beyond ether or chloroform, both of which carried their own risks. Hospitals, for those who could afford them, were changing too. Once seen as places of last resort, they were slowly becoming centers of healing and scientific research. In the large cities, institutions like Johns Hopkins in Baltimore began to set new standards for medical education and practice. Clean white tiles, electric lighting, and sterilized instruments were introduced. Nurses, many trained in the traditions of Florence Nightingale, brought order and compassion to the wards. Yet outside these centers of progress, small-town hospitals remained dimly lit, crowded, and poorly equipped. The stench of sickness clung to their hallways, and the cries of patients echoed through their drafty rooms. For many Americans, healthcare was not about modern medicine, but about endurance. Miners who inhaled coal dust, factory workers who lost fingers to machines, and farmers injured by plows often carried their scars and pains for life. Workplace accidents were treated with crude bandaging and little follow-up. Chronic conditions such as tuberculosis, which filled lungs with fluid and left sufferers gasping for air, spread relentlessly in crowded urban housing. Sanitariums, quiet institutions in the countryside, were promoted as refuges for patients to breathe fresh air and recover strength. For some, they provided comfort. For many, they offered only a slow and inevitable decline. At the same time, a growing faith in science was beginning to reshape expectations. Public health campaigns encouraged hand-washing, cleaner streets, and vaccinations against diseases like smallpox. Medical schools were being reformed, replacing haphazard apprenticeships with rigorous scientific training. A sense of transition permeated the air. It was as though America was standing on the threshold between two worlds. The old, where superstition and snake oil held sway, and the new, where laboratories and research promised cures that once seemed unimaginable. The atmosphere of early 20th century medicine was one of uncertainty, tinged with both hope and fear. For a mother in a tenement, holding her feverish child, hope might come in the form of a bottle from the corner druggist's label filled with grandiose claims. For a wealthy family in a grand mansion, hope came from the steady hand of a private physician, his words calm even as his knowledge remained incomplete.
Oh.
The sights of glistening instruments, the sounds of coughs echoing in narrow rooms. The taste of bitter tonics swallowed with grim resolve were part of the medical experience of that era. Looking back, it is easy to see how fragile life remained in those years. Yet within that fragility lay resilience. Families endured loss, but they also adapted, passing on remedies, finding comfort in one another, and trusting that progress would someday bring relief. And indeed, within a generation, medicine would be transformed by antibiotics, by vaccines, by new machines that could peer inside the body. But in the early 1900s, life was still balanced precariously between ancient practices and the dawn of modern science. The reflection that emerges from this era is simple. Human beings have always sought relief from pain, and in every age, they use what knowledge they have at hand. In the early 20th century, that knowledge was imperfect, but it was also growing. From the quack remedies of the druggist's shelf to the sterilized wards of new hospitals, medicine was in motion, inching forward, step by careful step, and those who lived through it, rich and poor alike, carried the scars, the lessons, and the hopes of an age in transition. In the early 20th century, life for most Americans was marked by long hours of labor, crowded homes, and daily struggles that left little room for rest. Even in those years, people sought moments of escape. Entertainment became a precious balm, offering laughter, music, flickering images that transported audiences far from the soot-stained streets and the harshness of factory floors. Whether in a noisy vaudeville theater, a smoky Nickelodeon, or a silent film house with its piano accompaniment, the atmosphere of leisure was something both rich and poor could experience, though never in quite the same way. Imagine walking down a bustling urban street around 1910. Horse-drawn wagons clattered alongside. Early automobiles. The air was heavy with the smells of roasting peanuts, street dust, and smoke from chimneys. Amid the shop windows and vendors shouting their wares, there would be a marquee lit with electric bulbs, a Nickelodeon. For 5 cents, one could step inside a dimly lit room where rows of wooden chairs faced a white screen. The hum of conversation would quiet as the first flickering images appeared, black hand-white figures moving jerkily across the film. A pianist, often seated in the corner, played lively tunes or dramatic chords to match the scenes. To working families, this small escape was worth the nickel. They could, for a brief half-hour, forget the crowded tenements and lose themselves in a tale of adventure, romance, or comedy. Nickelodeons were democratic spaces filled with immigrants, children, and laborers. The audience was often restless, sometimes loud, and yet united by the wonder of moving pictures. A boy who had spent the day shining shoes could laugh at the antics of a comedian tumbling across the screen. A weary mother might sigh at a romantic melodrama that hinted at lives far different from her own. The cheap seats and crowded halls made these shows accessible. Even if the benches were hard and the air stifling with the scent of sweat and tobacco smoke, for those with more money, entertainment took on a different form. Vaudeville. The vaudeville theater was a grander affair, its stages decorated with velvet curtains and golden trim. Performances included comedians, singers, dancers, jugglers, magicians, and animal acts. A typical evening might stretch for hours, with one act tumbling after another in rapid succession. The atmosphere was noisy and exuberant, with laughter, applause, and the occasional heckle rising from the crowd. To the rich, vaudeville was a fashionable night out. To the working classes, it was a cherished indulgence. The tickets cost more than a nickel, but they promised a spectacle of variety and surprise. The performers themselves often lived precarious lives. Many traveled from town to town by train, carrying only trunks of costumes and props. Behind the bright lights of the stage, the dressing rooms were cramped and musty, filled with the smell of grease paint and the sound of hurried rehearsals. For every star who made a fortune, dozens more scraped by, performing night after night for modest wages. Yet the stage offered hope a chance to be seen, to be remembered, and perhaps to escape the anonymity of ordinary life. Silent pictures began to grow from Nickelodeon novelties into full-length films that drew larger audiences. By the 1910s, movie palaces, lavish theaters with chandeliers, plush seats, and soaring ceilings were being built in big cities. Wealthy patrons arrived in fine clothing, while poorer families saved coins for the cheaper seats. The flickering images grew more sophisticated, with dramatic storylines, imaginative sets, and stars whose names became household words. The faces of Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks began to light up screens across the country. Even without spoken dialogue, audiences understood the emotions, guided by exaggerated gestures and the music that filled the air. The atmosphere of these early film houses was electric. It's a faint smell of popcorn mixed with the scent of polished wood and heavy curtains. Children whispered excitedly as the screen came to life. Lovers held hands in the dark, sharing glances as the story unfolded. For a time, the worries of daily life faded into the shadows, replaced by laughter, gasps, and quiet awe. But entertainment also reflected divisions of class. The poor sat shoulder to shoulder in crowded Nickelodeons, often watching films through a haze of smoke and chatter. The rich, meanwhile, enjoyed the comfort of opera houses and luxurious theaters. Yet both groups shared something essential: the desire to be transported beyond themselves, to see new worlds, to feel part of a story larger than their own. The lesson of early 20th century entertainment is that escape, however brief, is a vital part of human life. The laughter of vaudeville, the flickering magic of Nickelodeons, and the elegance of silent film palaces offered relief from hardship and a taste of joy. Even in an age marked by poverty, long hours of labor, and uncertainty, people found ways to dream through stories. Songs and the moving pictures that would soon transform culture forever. The early 20th century in America was an age of progress for some. Yet for many it was an age defined by exclusion, prejudice, and systemic injustice. While the nation boasted of industrial advances, glittering cities, and newfound opportunities, a darker reality persisted beneath the surface, one marked by rigid segregation, racial violence, and daily humiliations. For millions of African Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, and other marginalized groups, the dawn of the new century did not bring liberation, but rather reinforced barriers that limited every aspect of life. Walking through the streets of a southern town in 1910, one would see the physical signs of segregation plainly. Wooden boards or painted signs marked the entrances to train stations, theaters, restaurants, and even public fountains, white only and colored. On the trains, African Americans sat in separate cars, the smell of coal smoke drifting through the worn upholstery, the sound of the engine clattering louder in the older, less comfortable sections. In movie houses, they were ushered to balconies far from the polished velvet seats of the main floor. Even cemeteries were divided by race, the divisions etched not just in life but in death. The sensory atmosphere of this segregation was palpable. Imagine the frustration of waiting outside a gleaming restaurant, catching the scent of roasting meats and fresh bread through an open door, yet being told entry was forbidden. Picture standing in line at a crowded train station, the echo of whistles and shuffling feet around you, while a uniformed attendant directed you away from the bright, clean waiting room to a smaller, dingier space. These small daily indignities were constant reminders of a society built upon division. For African Americans in the South, this system was enforced by law, what we now call Jim Crow. Schools were separate and unequal. The wooden desks and colored classrooms chipped and broken, textbooks hand-me-downs from white schools, parks and libraries, if available at all, were poorly maintained. Opportunities for advancement were scarce, and even basic voting rights were stripped away through poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. For the poor white laborer, life was often hard as well, but his path remained open in ways forever closed to his black neighbor. The contrast between rich and poor, black and white, was especially stark in cities. In the North, African Americans migrated in growing numbers during what would become known as the Great Migration. They sought factory jobs, fresh starts, and escape from the brutality of the South. Yet in New York, Chicago, and Detroit, They often found themselves confined to overcrowded neighborhoods. The streets bustled with the cries of peddlers, the laughter of children playing stickball, and the strains of music from churches and clubs. But beyond those lively streets lay barriers, housing restrictions, job discrimination, and simmering resentment from white workers who feared competition. The wealthy lived another reality altogether. In their grand mansions or suburban estates, they enjoyed comfort untouched by the hardships of segregation. For them, the debate over race was often distant, something read about in newspapers over a breakfast of fresh fruit and coffee. Yet even in the North, racial prejudice was woven quietly into social life. Restrictive clubs, universities closed to minorities, and unspoken rules of exclusion. Perhaps most painful were the acts of violence that reinforced this oppressive system. Lynching was a terrifying reality. A rumor, an accusation, or even a simple act of defiance could lead to mob violence. The crackle of torches in the night, the roar of angry voices, the chilling silence that followed, all served as brutal warnings. Entire communities lived under the shadow of fear, knowing that law enforcement often looked the other way or even participated. Yet amid this harsh reality, there was resilience. Churches rang with hymns, sung in strong, steady voices. Black newspapers printed editorials demanding justice. Their ink smudged on the hands of readers who passed them from neighbor to neighbor. In cities, cultural movements began to stir. Jazz and blues carried stories of sorrow and endurance. Writers and speakers challenged prejudice, calling for dignity and equality. The lesson of racial segregation in early 20th century America is that progress in one part of society often coexisted with deep injustice in another. While the wealthy admired the rise of skyscrapers and electric lights, millions endured the dim reality of exclusion. Yet those who suffered found ways to hold fast, to build communities, to educate their children, to sing, to write, and to dream of something better. Looking back, the contrast is sobering. In an age that celebrated modernity, millions were denied its benefits. But the endurance of those communities reminds us of a truth. Injustice may silence, but it cannot wholly extinguish hope. Even in the darkest years, seeds of change were planted, seeds that would, decades later, grow into movements for civil rights and equality. When the First World War broke out in Europe in 1914, many Americans viewed it as a distant storm. The crack of rifles in the trenches of France, the rumble of artillery across Belgium, and the shrill whistle of shells tearing through the air seemed far removed from the daily lives of those in small American towns or bustling cities. Yet as the war dragged on, its shadow grew longer, and by 1917, when the United States entered the conflict, the lives of ordinary Americans were transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The soundscape of America changed. In factories, the steady rhythm of sewing machines was replaced with the pounding of metal presses producing helmets, rifles, and shells. The smell of hot oil and iron filled the air, mingling with the sweat of men and women who worked long hours to supply the war effort. In rural communities, the silence of fields was broken by the whir of new machines tractors replacing farmhands who had gone to fight overseas. Posters plastered on brick walls and wooden fences urged citizens to buy Liberty bonds and save food for the army. The faces of stern Uncle Sam, pointing his finger, became a familiar presence on every street corner. For the soldiers, life was forever altered. Young men who had grown up in quiet villages suddenly found themselves aboard crowded trains, the scent of coal smoke clinging to their uniforms as they were carried toward distant ports. Ships packed with troops crossed the Atlantic, their decks echoing with nervous laughter, the salty wind mingling with the acrid smell of seasickness. Soon these men were thrust into the mud of Europe, where the stench of damp earth, sweat, and gunpowder filled their senses. Letters home carried tales written in shaky handwriting, stories of endless rain, of the distant thunder of cannons, of comrades lost in the chaos of no man's land. Back home, families felt the war in different ways. In the kitchens of working-class households, mothers stretched meals as far as possible. The government encouraged meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays, and families dutifully adjusted, eating more beans, cornmeal, and vegetables from small backyard gardens. The wealthy, though less affected, also performed gestures of sacrifice, sending donations, organizing relief efforts, or attending gala fundraisers in glittering ballrooms, where chandeliers sparkled above tables laden with food. Yet the contrast remained. For the poor, sacrifice was a necessity. For the rich, it was often symbolic. Women stepped into roles that had once been considered unthinkable. With so many men overseas, women worked in munitions factories, their hands blackened with powder, their aprons stained with grease. They became streetcar conductors, clerks, and even police matrons. The click of typewriters echoed in offices filled with women, their faces set with determination. For some, this taste of independence marked the beginning of new possibilities. For others, it was simply another burden added to the weight they already carried at home. Immigrant communities faced their own trials. German Americans, once secure in their traditions, now felt the sting of suspicion. German-language newspapers declined, and sauerkraut was patriotically renamed Liberty Cabbage. The sounds of German hymns and folk songs grew quieter, as families worried about appearing disloyal. For African Americans, the war opened opportunities and new tensions. Many left the South in the Great Migration, heading north to work in war industries. The sound of trains carrying these families northward echoed across the country, their baggage light but their hopes heavy. In new cities, they encountered fresh chances, but also new forms of discrimination. The war also brought a tide of grief. In small towns, church bells tolled for fallen sons. Black-edged notices appeared in newspapers, announcing the names of those who would not return. The smell of fresh-cut flowers at funerals mingled with the salt of tears. Communities carried their sorrow quietly, yet with dignity, even as they struggled to support one another through the weight of loss. When the war finally ended in 1918, relief spread like a sigh through the nation. Crowds filled city streets, waving flags, cheering and dancing to the sound of brass bands. In the air, there was the acrid scent of fireworks, the taste of victory sweetened by the knowledge that peace had returned. Yet beneath the celebrations lay exhaustion. Soldiers returned, changed, some with scars that never healed, others with eyes that seemed forever shadowed by memories of the trenches. Families tried to welcome them back with warmth, yet many struggled to understand the silence that followed. The lesson of the First World War for America was complex. The nation discovered its growing power on the global stage, yet also its vulnerability. Ordinary lives were reshaped by sacrifice, by grief, and by new roles that would echo into the decades to come. The war revealed the strength of communities, the endurance of families, and the cost of global conflict. It was, for many, a reminder that even faraway storms can alter the daily rhythms of life at home. In the stillness that followed, Americans reflected. It endured food shortages, grief, suspicion, and sacrifice. It cheered for peace and mourned for the lost. And in their resilience, they carried forward not only memories of the battlefield, but lessons of unity and endurance that would prepare them for the next great trials of the century. As the 20th century opened, America was a nation caught between hardship and hope. Factories rumbled, farms spread across endless plains, and cities rose with their steel skeletons reaching toward the clouds. Yet behind every innovation and every triumph lay the daily realities of people simply trying to endure. Their stories of sweat-soaked laborers, weary mothers, restless children, and ambitious dreamers wove together into the fabric of a country learning to carry both struggle and progress side by side. Walking through the memory of those years, one can almost hear the contrasts. The shriek of whistles as factory shifts ended, men and women filing out with soot on their faces. The creak of wooden floorboards in cramped tenement apartments, the air heavy with the smell of boiled cabbage and coal smoke. In contrast, the quiet murmur of conversation in grand drawing rooms, where wealthy families sipped tea from delicate porcelain cups while a servant discreetly tended to the fire. Two Americas existed side by side, one defined by scarcity, the other by abundance. And yet within both, there was endurance. The poor found strength in community, neighbors looking after one another, sharing food when pantries ran empty, sharing stories when nights felt long. The wealthy, too, endured, though their struggles were of a different kind. The weight of expectation, the pressure to display success, the subtle loneliness hidden beneath grandeur. The atmosphere of early 20th century America was full of tension, but also of resilience. Trains rumbled across the land, carrying immigrants in search of opportunity, farmers shipping their crops and workers moving to new cities. The sound of those wheels on steel tracks echoed the motion of a nation in flux. In the countryside, roosters crowed, fields stretched endlessly beneath wide skies. The scent of earth and sweat lingered in the air. In the cities, electric lights buzzed faintly, Nickelodeons flickered, and street vendors shouted above the noise of trolley bells and clattering hooves. Life was not easy. Accidents maimed workers, disease claimed children, and prejudice divided communities. Yet, in the face of hardship, there was also music, the strains of ragtime drifting from saloons, hymns sung in wooden churches, laughter rising from theater balconies. Even in the poorest corners of society, hope found expression in song, in faith, and in the quiet determination to keep going. The lesson of this era is not simply that life was brutal, though it often was. It is that human beings endure, adapt, and find ways to dream even when circumstances are against them. The mother who rocked her sick child to sleep with a lullaby, the father who returned home after 12 hours in the factory and still managed to smile, the child who pressed her nose against a shop window imagining a different life, these quiet acts of endurance defined the century's beginning. As the century moved forward, great changes would come. Medicine would advance, technology would flourish, and voices once silenced would begin to demand recognition. Yet the endurance of those who lived through the early years laid the foundation for all that followed. Their lives remind us that hardship, though heavy, can also build resilience, and that struggle, though painful, can also give rise to strength. So as you rest now, let the echoes of that age fade gently. Imagine the soft glow of a street lamp in 1905, its light pooling on a cobblestone street. Picture the distant whistle of a train rolling into the night, carrying workers home. Feel the quiet strength of those who lived through that time, who bore their burdens with patience, who dreamed of better days to come. History reminds us that even in hardship, people endured. Now, you may rest peacefully.